What up, everyone? It is your boy, Murder Mystery with Joey, and we are back at you with another one. This one, we're diving into the story and a few other stories of the Skinwalker. Ooh. Alright, let's dive right in. My father told me a story once. I'll never forget it. For a few reasons. I think it's the first story he ever told me as a child, and it's also the story of how my grandfather died. But honestly, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about ghosts and aliens, and you think to yourself, that ain't real. They're making it up, or they're mistaken, or they're crazy, or something like that. You just can't believe it. That is, until something happens. Something that brings it all together, connects the dots in a way you didn't think of before. Maybe it happens to you. Maybe you hear the same story again and again from different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. As I said, this is a story my father told me, but I never believed it, even though he swore up and down it was true. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet that I started to believe. I started to hear other stories just like the one my father told me. It didn't take me long to believe after that. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the online community had taken to calling it. When he chose to call it something other than it, or that thing, he called it a skinwalker, after an old Cherokee tale his grandfather told him. But I'll tell you the story, the way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night in the woods surrounding the dairy farm in Ohio where we lived at the time, he'd tell me. We were tracking coyotes. We'd kill them for $50 a skin. They'd kill calves sometimes. We'd do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes, while we were out, we'd come onto a deer and kill it. Our landlord didn't mind, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home, walking because we didn't have a car or four-wheeler back then. We'd cut through the woods. That's when we came upon it. Blood. Everywhere. Splattered on the trees, and the grass, and the creek. Everywhere. At first, we figured it was a pack of coyotes. We'd seen how sometimes, when they weren't able to scavenge for whatever reason, they'd start hunting deer or cattle out of desperation. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs, but this wasn't like that. You see, when a pack of dogs, wolves, or coyotes attack something, they do it right. They'll pick off one that's weak, sick, or old, or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner someplace it can't get out of, and they'll run it right into the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see the alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. All of a sudden, its throat will be torn out, and it'll drop dead. It's quick, and it's clean. That was not what happened here. Something had come upon a group of deer. Coyotes won't attack a group. Wolves wouldn't either. They'd get too much of a fight. There were three, I think. 3 bodies just absolutely torn apart. You'd see a head or a torso here, or a leg there. Predators don't do that. They don't leave scraps behind. Whatever had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. But we didn't know it at that time, of course. We just saw a bunch of carcasses and figured it's something we had to take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home, that he thought it was the work of a pack of feral dogs. But I wasn't leaving him, and I damn sure wasn't hiking through 2 miles of woods alone, in the dark, with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. I was only 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was the only gun I could reliably use. Dad had the shotgun, and I wasn't going anywhere without it, or him. It took me a while to convince him, but finally we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't hard. We just followed the blood. Either that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. What I do know is that I'd never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing the most horrible sounds now. I've been in a lot of woods in my life, and I've been all over the world, but I've never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. I heard deer, fox, rabbits, raccoons, and birds. All of them afraid of something and hightailing it. Keep in mind, this is maybe 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning. Except for the fox and some birds, nothing was supposed to be awake at that hour. But they weren't just awake, mind you. They were on the run. That night I saw flocks of birds flying straight into trees trying to escape something. We came upon a pack of coyotes and nearly shot a couple thinking they had their eyes on us. But then we saw they were running in from someone. Nothing toward us. They didn't even notice us and went right past. Then some deer did the same. Then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple of wild hogs. These critters were supposed to be hunting each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting as far away from there as possible. We should have put two and two together, that maybe whatever we were tracking wasn't something we were supposed to see, and wasn't something we could kill. To this day, I don't know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go towards trouble, to fight. And being aware of the things my father did during the war, I figured it was best to stay by his side. We finally reached an open valley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. So when we saw the tracks, animals fleeing the forest had leveled everything in their path, but where that deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step. It was like whatever was responsible had left it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing 40 pounds soaking wet can tear out your throat if you ain't careful. The fact that this thing was on the lighter side just meant it was probably quick and was going to be tough to hit. So we followed the tracks, and it didn't take us long to find where they led. There's an old schoolhouse that sits on top of a hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, but nobody lived there, not for a long time. Sometimes, we caught homeless people in there, or drug addicts looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was some sick kid riding a high, but we didn't think that for long. We got within 50 yards. We heard a noise, a sort of screech made up of two different sounds. One was high-pitched, and another was a low growl. It was making both sounds at the same time, if that makes any sense. We approached to within 20 yards, and we heard another sound, different this time. I remember thinking that it sounded like paper being torn apart, while someone was swinging water back and forth in a bucket. Dad looked at me, knelt down, and whispered. He told me I had to stay behind him, because we're about to corner our prey. Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially a predator. But we can tell by the tracks there's only one. He tells me it's probably a single feral dog, most likely rabid. The plan, he said, was to sneak up on it while it was eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting it until it didn't move anymore, then slit its throat. And if it got to Dad, it was my job to shoot or stab it to get it off him. So he walked up with me right behind him, just a tad to his side, so I could see what it is. Wish to this day I hadn't. It was leaning over a carcass, tearing off its flesh, and throwing what it didn't nibble at a side. There was blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It was pale white, and looked a little like a man, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like ours, but it sat like a monkey, hunched over, and its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we saw that. My dad hesitated. He wasn't about to fire at a person, so he cleared his throat to try and get it to turn around. I swear to God Almighty, all the noise just ceased in an instant. I had never heard true silence before that, and never again afterward. But for 2 seconds, nothing made any noise, and I mean nothing. This made it all the louder when that thing turned around, made this shrill cry, and pounced on Dad. He got a shot off. I think he missed. If he hit it, it didn't faze the thing at all. But it was on him, tearing entire parts off of him. I started shooting it with the .22 point blank, but the thing barely bled at all. I got off 5 rounds, and I started hitting it with the butt of the gun. It didn't budge, or even register that I was there. It was clawing at my dad, removing whole chunks of his flesh. It started on his torso, peeling off the skin on his chest, and then it moved up. It tore out his throat, ripped his nose clean off, and gouged out his eyes. Then it scalped him, started digging in. I stood there, helpless, as it ripped off the bottom half of his jaw, the little bones and that tube in his neck, and then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ended up in this thing's shoulder. My dad, well, what was left of him, that is, ended up on my back. I was running, and by God, I was going faster than I'd ever run before or after, and it was following me. I ended up back in the forest, opposite the woods we started in. I was heading towards my landlord's house because it was the closest thing to help nearby, but even that was half a mile away. All the while, I could hear the thing screeching and moaning. I heard branches cracking and getting thrown around. It was cracking so loud and often that it sounded like someone was taking an axe to every single tree I passed, but I never looked back, not once. The thought didn't even cross my mind. Finally, I tripped and fell into some gravel. I looked up to see my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. I screamed and cried, and they came over. I told them to call an ambulance. My landlord looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "What is that on your back?" he asked me. Just as the words left his mouth, it dawned on him without me saying a word. It was one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere, he realized. It was damn near all that was left of my dad, aside from a bit of my father's head and torso. That's all there was. Absolutely nothing below the waist. Suddenly we heard it. The screeching. My landlord grabbed me, causing me to drop what's left of Dad on the ground, and I was fighting him, crying because I thought we could still save him. Somehow. But the truth is, my dad had been gone well before I ever picked him up, and all I'd done was carry a corpse back home. My landlord had to pick me up and throw me inside before I would go with him. He and his buddies, all of us went inside together, and they locked the doors and got their guns. The landlord asked me, "What happened? What happened?" But I didn't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it together to understand there was something dangerous out there. All the lights in the house were on, and someone called the cops. They would get there as soon as they could, they said, but that meant in 15 minutes. We looked outside and saw it walk in front of the fire they'd made. No one knew what it was. One of them said it looked like an ape. Suddenly, something came crashing through the window. We all fired at it, but quickly realized it wasn't a thing. It was my landlord's dog. Well, his body anyway. His head and legs were missing. We had just started pushing things in front of doors and windows to form a barricade when we heard something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open. We heard metal and glass being ripped and smashed. We dragged the couch and TV in front of the door to the garage for added measure. It banged around some more, but then it got quiet. Not silent like it was before. We could hear it move around some. The guys were talking, making sure their guns were ready. Someone handed me a pistol. No sooner I had cocked the hammer back when we heard something shatter upstairs. Then we heard it screech again, except this time it was louder. It didn't echo and fade out, because it was inside. We all rushed to the one door that led upstairs. We got to it just as that thing did. It opened it just a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it. It managed to get his hand through. Someone with a shotgun took care of that, put the barrel right up to his wrist and pulled the trigger, blew his hand clean off. That only pissed it off, though. Started shoving that door, clawing. We were on one side, pushing as best as we could, and it was on the other, doing the same. The wood wasn't going to hold, so someone told us to keep our heads down. Suddenly, the top half of the door was gone, and my ears were ringing. There were splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them had just unloaded on the top of the door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police got there. I was still glued to what was left of the door. The sun was up before they pried me loose. They put me in a hospital for a while. While I was there, a whole lot of people talked to me. I didn't respond. Not for a long, long time. When I got back home, I got a job for the landlord, working on the farm. We didn't talk much, not about that thing, but I signed up for the army when I was 19. He sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I asked him right away what the police told him. The story they went with was that it was a wild animal, probably a wolf or maybe a bear that had migrated north. I asked him how they could say that when they had the hand. He looked at me right away, stunned. The hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car got into a wreck, drove into a tree, and died on impact. The hand was never found, likely taken by an animal. The cops, when they would acknowledge the hand existed at all, said it was simply the paw of a bear that resembled a man's. Never talked to the landlord again. He went missing while I was in basic training, and no one ever saw him again. There were rumors that he owed some people some money and skipped town, but I don't think it's that simple. As for me, I never went back to those woods, wouldn't even if I had the whole goddamn U.S. Army at my back. That was the extent of what my father told me about the incident in the woods. There's just one problem, however. My father lied. When my mom died, I didn't think my father felt he had anything left and that he might as well settle old scores. He returned to those woods. He never came back either. The FBI was called, and they came and put on a show for everyone involved, but I knew they weren't really looking. I had to get an agent drunk and slip him a few 50s before he finally told me that they get a few calls about those woods every year, about someone up and vanishing, but that was all he wanted to tell me. Before he got up and left with the rest of his team, he wrote the name they'd given the creature on a napkin. Of course, I didn't realize that's what it was at first. It wasn't until I put the words in a search engine that I understood what they meant. Honestly, I would have rather not known. As it turns out, there are hundreds of stories just like my father's, as well as photos and drawings of the thing. And though the details vary, everyone who's encountered agrees on one thing. It's still out there. And there isn't a man on earth that could stop it. My name is Lamar. I'm currently 15 and live in the state of Oregon. What I'm about to share with you is 100% real. If you have the choice of not believing me, I guess I could add you to the list. Sorry I'm getting off topic. My first encounter with the Wendigo happened when I was 13. I was on a hunting trip with my grandpa Wayne. He was a retired army vet. The reason I'm telling you this will come later. We were out hunting rabbits and hares because I thought the only way to become a man was to go out and hunt something. And also my mom kind of forced me to do it. She said I was too much of a shut-in sitting on my goddamn Xbox too much, and I ended up getting a lecture about how she was my age, she'd be outside, yada yada yada. So as soon as my grandpa brought it up, she jumped at the opportunity to get me out the house. To be honest, it was quite fun except for the not showering for a week. We were winding down for our last night there, only being able to snag 3 rabbits mainly because I'm such a shit shot. The sun was starting to set. We decided to hit the hay in our all too big and expensive tent made for 6, even though I was only 5'10" at the time and he's 5'11", but I guess he needed his space. It's around 2 a.m. I only know this because I'd snuck my phone out when my mom wasn't looking, when we started noticing strange noises like something heavy stomping around our campground. Then we noticed a horrid smell like rotted meat and dead skunk. We thought it was maybe the rabbit. My grandpa told me there's no way that the rabbits the smell was too strong. It took everything in our power not to start gagging. For me, it takes a lot to make me gag. I'm a teenage boy with 2 dogs. The smell even made my eyes start to water. My grandpa had also reminded me the rabbits were outside, so the thought had popped in my head that the noises could be a bear. My grandfather shut that thought down fast, and he said there's no way that's a bear. I almost pissed myself. What could be that big? I'm no hunting expert, but I'm pretty sure no other animal could be that big. Grandpa told me to stay put while he checked it out. He looked outside of our tent's window, and then I saw his eyes bulge with what looked like fear. As if he could read my mind, he put his hand over my mouth to shush me. I had then gotten frustrated with him and moved his hand off my face and asked him what was going on. He then looked at me with fake calmness and said, "Grandson, that's no bear." I got tired of hearing that and went to go see what he had seen. I lifted the flap of the tent window and looked out, and I even laughed a bit. So when I look in the direction of where he was looking, all I see is a pair of antlers sticking out of the bushes. I even attempted to put it on Snapchat to show everyone how bad my grandpa is with jokes. My phone dies, which pisses me off because I have nothing to keep me entertained for the car ride back to Portland all the way from Eastern Oregon. I was cursing myself for not turning it off during the trip to conserve power. But while I'm doing that, the thing I thought was some sort of buck or elk started to rise up. Then I got a good look at the face that was carrying those antlers. The first thing I saw was those cold, dead, hungry, red eyes, then the whole face. Dear God, I wish I hadn't. It had a skull-like face like some sort of canine. It had black, matted fur that threatened to fall off with the slightest touch, then it rose higher. I saw the rest of it, long, slender arms, claws on each of its hands, bones that threatened to tear its skin with the slightest wrong movement. Then I noticed the teeth that could tear the flesh from anything if it wanted to. I was so scared I had even started crying. My grandpa pulled me down and kept asking me over and over, "Did it see you?" My grandfather told me the only thing I could say was, "Wendigo." He said I was in a trance-like state, like he tried to get me to snap out of it, but he couldn't. But one thing that got me to snap out of it was the inhuman screech. And what I had heard, it's like nothing what people say. It's like, imagine an eagle screech, but its screech would make its throat start to rip and tear, and then mix it with a man screaming in agony, and that's the sound you would get. Then we heard it leave the bush and enter our camp. It then let out another screech, which made me cover my head and fall to the ground crying. My grandpa wasn't able to get as good of a view as I had, so he silently zipped down the tent and peeked outside, and when he did, he immediately zipped it back up. My grandpa came back with the most terrified look on his face, which terrified me even more because my grandpa had watched his best friend get murdered. He's seen people burned alive after they were hit with napalm. He's 200 pounds of muscle, and to see that much fear in his face was scary. We then remembered we had left our rabbits right by our tent. Then we heard it coming our way. I could see the shape of it. This thing was most likely 3 feet taller than us. I then heard it start to crunch and tear the rabbits apart outside, which makes me think that it will do it to us if it finds us. It then crunched loudly, which made me whimpier, which caused the creature to raise its head and let out another deafening screech. Which at that point I couldn't take it anymore and broke down crying for my mom. The creature then started circling the tent and would sometimes flinch at us. The thing was playing with us, which made me pissed. This thing was playing with us like we were toys and enjoyed our suffering. Could easily cut through our tent and get to us, but what we were going to do with it, our mental and measly hunting knife. We went hunting, and now we've become the hunted. What came next will stay with me for the remainder of my life. It cut through our tent, put its head inside the tent. My grandpa immediately went into protective mode and put me behind him. I was too much of a coward to look into the face of death. My grandfather had the heart of a lion, in that moment, knife in hand, ready to fight. All I could do was cry to his back. He then made a ballsy move and took his eye off the monster in front of us to tell me he's sorry and that he loves me. I looked at him and then went back to crying and told him in between breaths I loved him too. The creature seemed annoyed at that point and attempted to get his hands through. When it did, my grandfather let out a yell and stabbed his hand, which made the creature rear back in pain and let out yet another screech. The creature was beyond pissed at this time. It was about to go in for another round, but the scent had started to rise. The creature slowly backed away and headed back into the brush, but then turned around and looked through the hole it had created. And I swear it smiled as if to say this isn't over. It retreated back into the forest. I was too stunned to move. My grandpa had sprung into action, leaving over $1,000 of gear, and pulled me away to our car. He didn't even put on his seatbelt as he floated out of there. We didn't start talking until we were on the freeway back home, and he asked me in a calm voice did I know what that thing was, to which he then stated all he could get to me to say was Wendigo. I replied those were the only words that came to mind. Me and my grandpa talked about it from time to time, and I started doing research on what that creature could be. The only thing that matched my description was Wendigo. I know this was only one encounter this whole time, but I'll be sure... and I mean I'll be sure, to remember it. And that is it for our stories on the Wendigo so far. We will be diving back into it, of course, as with all the other cryptids that we talk about. It is your boy, Murder Mystery with Joey. And remember, if you like the story, hit the follow, hit the subscribe. You know? Do that. You stay classy. Have a good day.